Some universities have made a start by setting up task forces to investigate anti-Semitism. It seems to me that's sort of trendy, and it's a response to Trump, and they should be doing more than just looking at anti-Semitism. They should be looking at orthodoxy and whether orthodoxy is being promoted or insisted upon in the classroom.
Welcome to The Contrarian. I'm David Bernstein. In a world filled with noise, I'm here to provide the signal. Hello, this is David Bernstein, the host of the Contrarian podcast, and I'm here today with Professor Suzanna Sherry, who is a professor emerita at Vanderbilt Law School, someone who has written about subjects that are near and dear to me, and I've read her from afar, and I'm really delighted, Suzanna, to have you on the Contrarian podcast today.
I'm delighted to be here.
So, I wrote the book Woke Antisemitism, that came out in 2022, and people sometimes tell me, "Wow, you really saw this coming," blah 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 blah. And here you wrote with a co-author, and I'm forgetting his name, on critical race theory and anti-Semitism all the way back to 1997, really showing that you had much greater foresight than I ever did about how critical race theory and maybe the larger ideology that accompanies it was going to generate a kind of anti-Semitism. And I know you've written an update of that since, and we'll get into that, but just tell me, what inspired you to write about that in 1997, and what were you thinking at that time? It must have been, because no one knew what critical race theory was in 1997, except a few academics at law schools. I mean, how'd that come about?
Well, actually, first of all, my co-author is Dan Farber. He and I were both at the University of Minnesota together. He's now at Berkeley. I'm now at Vanderbilt, retired from Vanderbilt. And we started earlier than that. We started worrying about critical race theory in 1992. And the portion of the article that was about the anti-Semitism of critical race theory, we first published in 1995. And then we took a series of articles, beginning with the one in 1992, and we put them in the book, which is what you're referring to for 1997. Basically, we were reading everything that was being published about constitutional law and about courts, and we saw this critical race theory, and we found it very troubling. And we found it troubling for a number of reasons. It seemed to reject all of the Enlightenment values. It seemed to be sort of tribal. It was the beginning of identity politics. And so as we read more and more, we realized that this had anti-Semitic implications. And so we wrote an article about that.
Yeah. And you recently wrote sort of a rejoinder, I think, to that article. Maybe it was, a year ago or so? I'm not sure exactly when you sort of updated that. Tell me a little bit about how you've seen it evolve since those days, 20 some years ago already. Almost 30 years ago. Wow.
First, I think it went into hibernation because we published the book in 1997. There was a flurry of responses, most of them not positive, particularly from.
I know about those kinds of responses. I'm familiar with them. Yes.
But then the critical race theorists seemed to fade away in the law schools. I think part of what happened is many of them, because it was so popular and trendy, many of them who had been toiling away at less prestigious schools got hired by places like Penn and Columbia and Harvard. And then they didn't have to write as much anymore because they had climbed the ladder.
Pinnacle of academic success, right?
The pinnacle of academic success. So it seemed to just completely disappear until around, I guess, maybe 2016, maybe 2020, sometime in there, when it just came back in force, only it had changed its name. Now it was either wokeness or social justice or anti-racism, or most importantly, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I realized there was a a conference at Florida International University that was soliciting abstracts for people who wanted to speak. And I decided that the conference was on anti-Semitism and law. And I decided that it was time to remind people of the anti-Semitic nature of these types of theories. And so I submitted an abstract and it was accepted. And so I wrote sort of an updated article showing how critical race theory and DEI adopted the same sorts of principles and reiterating that those principles are inherently anti-Semitic.
You know, I look back at my own growing awareness of this phenomenon, and and then I write about this in the book. Actually, in the late 1990s, I was in what today would have been considered a DEI multi-day DEI workshop on multiculturalism. It was called then, and it was. It really drew on some of the same basic principles, and I was shocked at its sort of a liberalism and its insistence on its own truth. This is 1998, 1999, so it was clearly around there, but it seems to have morphed or just sort of come out of the box in in that sort of the mid 2014, 15, around that time, right? Like we saw this sort of resurgence of it with much more credibility than it had when you first wrote about it.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right, and it escaped from academia, and it certainly escaped from legal academia, and it spread throughout universities. And by now, I think it is maybe losing some momentum now, but by 2022 or so, it was not just in academia; it was all over corporations. Every corporation had their own DEI office. I think several things happened. One was when Trump was elected in 2016, the first time. I think there was sort of a reaction to that, and so progressives became more incensed and more vocal. And the other thing that happened, of course, was the murder of George Floyd in 2020 and the Black Lives Matter movement and all of that. And I think that jump-started DEI again.
Right. Yeah, Greg Lukianoff at FIRE has also written, I think Jonathan Haidt wrote about it as well in Coddling of the American Mind, that they also saw signs of this sort of resurgence in 2013, 2014, when you had the Ferguson riots and the emergence of Black Lives Matter, and also social media like Tumblr that came in, and all of a sudden, and I worked on a campus-oriented organization then, and I also wondered, like, what happened to all my moderate students? I mean, you could really sense the shift in political attitudes on campus around that time as well, and it just got more and more pronounced as up until George Floyd and the year or two afterwards.
I think that's right. I think you're right that the rise of social media really helped fuel this, as it has fueled so many sort of radical movements on the left and the right. I also think that it's interesting that you were talking about the Ferguson and I was talking about George Floyd. I think critical race theory and its successors get jump-started when there is dissatisfaction with racial progress. Because if the law isn't doing what we want it to do in eliminating discrimination, then people start trying to find other ways to do so, or at least other arguments.
Right. And the question is, was it not eliminating discrimination or not eliminating disparity?
I think you're right. I misspoke. It should be. It did not. And it's not that it didn't eliminate it. It's that it didn't eliminate it fast enough or make progress fast enough.
Right. And they looked at that and they said, well, there must be something wrong with our legal frameworks if there's continued disparity all these years later, rather than you could argue other factors or other things going on in society that might have still accounted for, persistent disparities.
But you're not allowed to say that. You're not allowed to argue that. Essentially,
right.
That's what DEI has done to our college campuses, is that you will be shunned and maybe fired if you try to suggest that there are other factors besides structural discrimination or systemic discrimination.
Right. And in some ways, this is a big enterprise devoted to trying to crowd out those arguments, to make it so that you can't advance another argument. Even, and I've been through the culture wars on this one more times than I care to remember. And it's always shocking that you have to be how I realize that that's really what it is a way of saying the only explanation is you're allowed to have for why there's persistent disparity is the one we're offering up, and anything else is completely beyond the pale. And they're reinforcing that. They're trying to reinforce that and prevent that. And what they don't realize is once you accept that basic proposition, it becomes it sort of filters into all of our politics and our social discourse and everything else, because that's the only thing you're allowed to talk about.
Yeah, they are, as I've said in my most recent essay, the DEI folks are imposing an orthodoxy, and it is their orthodoxy. It's interesting. One of the that you say that they're trying to crowd out all of the other arguments. I think you're absolutely right. But back in the 90s, one of the things we were worried about, Dan and I were worried about with critical race theory, besides its anti-Semitism, was its shutting down of argument. It was all about storytelling, they said, because my truth is different from your truth. And so all we can do is tell our stories. And to us, that suggested that there could be no rational debate. There was no way to communicate with people you disagreed with.
Right. I would actually argue that was the softer version of this ideology speaking, and what eventually it morphed into was standpoint epistemology, which held that if you were a marginalized community, only you could see these forces of white supremacy and power that were holding you down, because the average white person or whatever didn't have the insight to see it themselves, because they were blind to it. They were inadvertently part of the power structure doing the holding down. And so at some point it wasn't about contested ideas of truth where everybody's truths were equal. It was that certain truths based on your marginalized status gave you privileged insight into these problems in society.
It's funny that you use the word privilege, because that
right.
was basically the word that they use to marginalize everybody else, right? Check your privilege.
Exactly.
The people in the power structure, the people who are privileged, can't see it.
Right, but they were using power themselves to sort of push their own view. I spoke at a conference at University of Maryland on Saturday by Heterodox Academy, a group I'm fond of. And I was looking because it was at University of Maryland. I decided to look into what is their speech policy, and there was a really beautiful speech policy on university role and values. I just want to read it for a second. The ideas of different members of the campus community will often and quite naturally conflict, but it is not the proper role of UMD to attempt to shield individuals from ideas and opinions they find unwelcome, disagreeable, or even deeply offensive. Although UMD greatly values civility, and although all members of the campus community share in the responsibility for maintaining a climate of mutual respect, concerns about civility and mutual respect can never be used as a justification for closing off discussions of ideas, however offensive or disagreeable those ideas may be to some members of the community. I thought, wow, what a beautiful statement about the date.
Right. That's the Calvin principles. The university.
That's the Calvin principles, right? Principles. Put into by the General Counsel's office at University of Maryland, and that's right. Although the day before, there was my wife spoke to a guy who just started working at University of Maryland, and he was telling us about this issue that he's encountered in many classrooms, and it's called "ouch, oops." And what happens is, in a classroom, if you are offended or insulted by something you hear, you say "ouch," and the person who did the offending says "oops," and then you have about how they've been, you apologize for offending that person. Now there might be times when somebody legitimately or carelessly insults somebody, and you can say "ouch," and you insulted me if you don't want to say something so childish.
Used.
Yeah, but it's being used to actually shut down ideas, and it just sort of brought to life to me this very real conflict of, I won't call them values, but they are, but practices in universities, where on the one hand, they have this beautiful expression of freedom of speech on campus, and on the other, they have this pervasive practice of ouch, oops, that's in so many classrooms around the university, and how universities are speaking out of both sides of their mouths on these issues. What do you make of that?
Well, several things. To the extent that university administrators of all sorts are speaking out of both sides of their mouth, that's no surprise at all. They've been doing that always. I am not a big fan of university administrators in general. But it's not so surprising given how pervasive DEI is and how many faculty and students buy into it. It's not surprising that the university can put all these great sentiments on their website, and then nobody pays any attention to them.
Right. It's like you have two different university sets of values. One is the values of freedom of expression that are their official policy in many instances, but not all. And other is actually how they're this alternative universe that in no way, shape, or form adheres to those values. And that often has more purchase than the value statements that they've put up front and center on their websites.
Yeah, it's the culture. It's the culture versus the law, right? What the university puts on their website is the law. It's the university's official values, but the university culture is something entirely different. And I think you mentioned FIRE. They're finding that the universities are by and large getting worse at protecting free speech, and that students and faculty are afraid to speak out. There's one recent survey that said some huge percentage of students have pretended to be more progressive than they are in order to avoid being ostracized. That's a terrible situation for universities.
Do you have a theory of why it could be getting worse and not better, given all the political and social trends where you're seeing, past peak woke and the rest? Why is it that you were seeing those numbers?
I think DEI is largely to blame. It's been so entrenched in the culture. I think Trump is partly to blame. I mean, he certainly does not believe in freedom of speech, at least if freedom for me, but not for thee, as they say. And so it's just become legitimized on the left and on the right. That is, opposition to free speech, at least free speech by others, and taking offense at speech that others are making, that has become legitimized on both the left and the right. So I think it's sort of part of the whole.
Yeah, you wrote about that. You wrote about that recently in an essay. I noted that was part of, I think, a larger set of essays by Lee Bollinger, right?
Yeah, this one isn't published yet, but it's available on SSRN. Lee Bollinger and Jeff Stone are putting together a volume of essays, contributed essays about academic freedom in the era of Trump. And so they invited me to submit an essay, and I am back on my hobby horse of DEI and anti-Semitism, but also DEI and its effect on campus culture and its effect on speech, and to some extent, its effect on democracy.
Right. So let me. So you mentioned Trump and the role that the Trump administration plays, and first I'll say I probably share like most of your instincts on that. But I want to play devil's advocate. This is, after all, the Contrarian podcast, and it's an argument that I've heard others make, and it goes something like this. Okay, people like you and I, we write op-eds or scholarly articles or books or whatever. We make arguments, but that we're not really making a lot of progress against this sort of juggernaut of DEI and postmodernism on today's college campus, maybe a little bit, but it's still deeply entrenched. And while we have legitimate concerns that the Trump administration will replace one form of a liberalism with another form of a liberalism, as you said, free speech for me, but not for thee. The argument would go, he can only do so much damage in a couple years of doing this. There are 4,500 universities around the United States. And if he makes an example out of Harvard and Columbia and whatever, Northwestern and a few other places that are some of the most egregious actors, what that might do is create a chilling effect on DEI. It won't really change the entire university. You're not going to replace the DEI regime with the Trump regime on campus because it's just the numbers aren't there. They're just not there. There are overwhelmingly progressive professors on campuses that enjoy their pride of place. And just to continue 1 second on this, and then I'm going to ask for your thoughts on this. I was speaking to a professor about this, and I did my yesterday or Saturday actually when I was at that conference at lunch, and I played devil's advocate, and she got her back against the wall a little bit, and we had a little nice debate about it. And then she said something very interesting. She said, what I tell my colleagues? I tell my colleagues that we should pay a lot of attention to what Trump is doing, because I tell them that we have to get our own house together if we don't want our own house in order, if we don't want to go down this path of Trumpism. And I thought to myself, that's sort of a good argument for why my original point, which might be that even if we don't like it, and even if we fear its results, that maybe in effect, not by intent, but in effect, it will actually neutralize some of this radical ideology on campus over time and get us closer to liberalism than we were before.
Yeah, I don't think so. I would take issue with several things. First, he is using an axe instead of a scalpel. And
I agree.
So, and that's always problematic, dangerous. When you're talking about institutions that are university academic freedom, which is sort of fragile to begin with. I mean, people don't always understand the importance of the First Amendment, why we have one, why we have academic freedom, why we have tenure. So to some extent, the idea of the university's mission of being free of orthodoxy is a counterintuitive one to many people, and so it is in danger. And if you use an axe rather than a scalpel on a university, I think that's a bad thing. Second, I think he can do a lot of permanent damage in 4 years. He is basically shutting down university research, medical research.
But isn't he only hitting a few campuses on that? I mean, I deplore it. Let me be very clear. Like I do, the idea that we're using research at all as part of this larger culture war issue to me is abhorrent. But I even have friends who basically agree that there's some danger here, but even will say, well, look, he's using research. The research will migrate somewhere else. And here's the point: he needs an axe. This is not going to be changed with a scalpel. I mean, that's what their argument is, that we think it's going to be changed with it. We like to think so, but in reality, it's not going to really be changed with a scalpel.
Yeah, but where research is going to move is Europe and China.
That is a danger for sure. And
yes, he is only targeting a few universities, but he's threatening all of them. And he also has cut he's cut research funds by lowering the overhead. Now, I actually think that universities were charging overhead that's too high. And I think those sorts of contracts should be renegotiated. Some universities have high overhead and deserve it. Some don't have high overhead. So, but to lump everybody together and say it's only going to be, what did he say, 15% or something like that, and then basically shut down all the grant institutions, that affects every university, because every university uses grants, particularly for their scientific research.
Yeah. So I agree. That's all dangerous. And I don't know what the university will look like in 2 years, or whether or not you can, maybe we'll have another conversation and say, like, what happened 2 years later. And again, I wince at it all. And I think it feels very illiberal to me, but I'm not sure how things are going to end up. What universities' free speech will look like in 2 years either, whether it'll be worse in some measures and better in other measures. That'll be interesting. But, I go back to.
Yeah, no, I don't. I guess I don't know either. I just think that what he's doing is so illiberal and so dangerous, and will have at least some bad long-term effects, that even if it has some good long-term effects, I would rather trust universities to heal themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, and because that's the real question in some ways, and maybe my own doubt about whether they're capable of doing that without this sort of blunt force. I go back to the Florida legislation a few years ago that Ron DeSantis and Republican colleagues put forward that banned divisive concepts, in universities and in K through 12 schools. Now, I didn't like that at all, right? I think that was
Tennessee
deeply
has that law too.
right.
Where I am,
Yes.
Tennessee has that law.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, and I got in an interesting argument about it, and here's the thing about it: like for a while, universities were actually only teaching one thing. They were teaching Ibram X. Kendi, for example, anti-racism or whatever, DEI, and they were teaching nothing else. And now you're saying to ban that, and it created this interesting dilemma, because there was A, B, and what I wanted was C, but C wasn't on the menu. A was teach every student just anti-racism and DEI. B was ban both. I wanted C, which is to teach both and let them argue about it in the classroom. But I was thinking about it for a second. I thought, well, listen, what would I rather have if I were only had A or B on my multiple choice test, which is my kid would be indoctrinated in anti-racism DER, or my kid would be banned from learning about it. I think I'd probably choose B. Because in some ways, and the reason why I say that is because I don't like those choices. But the reason why I say that,
I got to interrupt you here, because I mean the problem is that your kid can't, if under the law, your kid can't be taught anti-racism, but probably your kid can't be taught about anti-Semitism and that it exists. Your kid can't be taught about the history of this country, including slavery. It's not
sure. Yeah, I'm not 100%. Sometimes that's a little overstated. Like I also know that Florida didn't stop teaching about slavery, but still, your point remains. And yes, if you chill one form of acceptable academic discourse, you end up chilling a lot more. But it's sort of, and a lot of my friends on the center left, which is the vast majority of the people I know, were up in arms about it, understandably and rightfully. But at the same time, like they couldn't bring themselves to say, but do you understand that what existed before was also deeply entrenched in liberalism, where you were only teaching one thing? And I feel like we have to, when we critique what Trump is doing, and I know you do this, you have a lot of street cred here, or when you critique what DeSantis did in divisive concepts. By the way, it turned out, I learned later, that wasn't in DeSantis's original plan, but rather other Republican legislators introduced the divisive concepts thing, and it ended up being part of the package. And so that he was just trying to stop critical race theory from being taught alone, and ended up pushing this divisive concept stuff. Anyway, which is a problem. And
at the University of Tennessee, shortly after the law took effect in Tennessee that you couldn't teach divisive concepts, they had a divisive concepts day. That is, a whole bunch of faculty, this can spread on the internet, decided that on a particular day, they were all going to teach divisive concepts. And I have a friend who teaches in the philosophy department. He was teaching a course, he taught Marxism that day. And somebody else, taught something else. Everybody.
Right. But I wonder if any of them actually said, okay, I'm going to teach a divisive concept like the critique of anti-racism or the critique of Marxism. Like,
I don't know. I don't know. But I just thought that was sort of an amusing response. Nobody was disciplined.
No, nor should they. And that's absurd that they would, if they would have been, or I think it's probably violative of the First Amendment.
It's all performative. It's all virtue signaling.
Yes. Yeah. So, I guess the question is, like, what do you think ought to be done? I mean, if you're a board of trustees at one of these universities, where there's where permissive divisive concepts hasn't been banned, you're in a red state with probably a blue area, but in a red state. what do you think? What do you think should be done in a lot of these places, these blue state universities, where there's still, sort of deeply entrenched DEI, that where it's sort of, even as the culture wars have sort of pushed it out of, let's say, corporations, they haven't yet succeeded in neutralizing it in the university settings, where you might even be seeing more of it, perhaps precisely because it's being pushed out everywhere else. What do you think how should we deal with it?
Well, I mean, for one thing, universities should adopt both the Chicago principles of free speech and the Calvin principles. So the universities should not be in the business of putting out speech themselves unless it directly affects them. So it'd be okay for a university to criticize what Trump is doing to universities, but it is not okay for universities to decide that they're going to put out a mass email about the overruling of Roe v. Wade, or about the war in Ukraine, or about the Middle East situation. That they should not be doing that, and they should be both allowing free speech of everybody, but punishing those who break the procedural rules, people who take over buildings, people who block access. But otherwise, no matter how offensive the speech, and I include anti-Semitic speech in that, it's offensive, but it should be protected. As long as nobody's breaking the rules. So that's the first thing they should do. They should foster a culture. I don't know exactly how they do this, but they should make it clear. They maybe invite speakers, have university sponsored events that invite speakers from different perspectives, either separately or together. Have people model the behavior that we want our students to learn. Right now, faculty are not modeling that behavior. Universities are not modeling that behavior. They are punishing the speech they don't like, and they are encouraging students to not to speak up. So the university has to start fostering free speech and modeling free speech. And frankly, I think they should start dismantling all the DEI offices and all the DEI vice provosts and vice deans and all the rest of it.
Right. It sort of structurally keeps alive this alternative culture that's against freedom of expression, because you have this bureaucracy that's constantly reinforcing the norms that they profess to oppose now, and it just, I just don't see. I think that's the issue there, is that, that they can't really live up to those values as long as those DEI bureaucracies.
I think that's right. And as long as, the students are taught about microaggressions and oops and ouch, or ouch and oops, I guess it is. But that's where maybe boards of trustees can do something, because they're not steeped in the university culture usually. I mean, people get on these boards because they give a lot of money to the university, but they're usually business people. So maybe that's the place to start, is to try to convince boards of trustees and the like, persuade them in some sense, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to show what's wrong with DEI, because there are a lot of people who think, oh, diversity, equity, inclusion, those things are great. How can we be against them? So I'm trying to show them what's wrong with it. And if enough people in positions of authority who are not steeped in the culture, if enough of them start believing that, then maybe things will change. Also, I think conservatives need, or people who are opposed to DEI, need to grow some backbone. They need to be able to speak up. And right now, both students and faculty are afraid to speak up. I think you just have to put yourself out there and say, this is wrong. I am witnessing something that's wrong, and take the blowback.
Yeah. Absolutely. And very few are willing to do it. I think there's more than there used to be. And there are conferences of people like the one I just went to over the weekend, where some academics get together and they're trying to form a core of people who give each other strength in that process. My organization, the North American Values Institute, is primarily concerned about K through 12 education. And we've actually adopted an institutional neutrality policy for K through 12. And I would sort of like your thoughts on that. K through 12 is a little different than universities. It's not subject, I think, entirely to by the sort of the First Amendment. There are First Amendment rights, but it doesn't. But you're dealing with kids here, underage kids here, who don't have all the same rights. But also, kids are also captive audience of, and so while I think you could probably justify having some politicized classrooms in the university, to do so in a K through 12 public school setting, for example, what seems to me like a huge imposition on a child whose teacher is telling them, what they must think about the world. I mean, do you have any thoughts on how we could take those same principles and how they might or might not apply to K through 12 public schools?
I think it's much harder because what you might view as politicizing, I might view as teaching
civic values or something.
Civic values, yes. So take something that's quite controversial, gay rights, right? I mean, I view that as sort of, we should teach students that there are people out there who are different in this way. I mean, age appropriate. That are different in this way, but we shouldn't. We should treat them just like everybody else. To me, that's just basic civic values. To a lot of people, that's brainwashing their kids, and it's sort of the opposite if you're teaching religion. Right? There are parents who want things like evolution banned from the schools, who want creationism taught in the schools, or want anti-gay religious beliefs taught in the schools. And so I'm not sure how you can translate sort of what you want in a culture, a free speech kind of culture, how you translate that to schools, which not only are dealing with kids, but they are trying to turn them into responsible adults.
Right. And then, but I hear you, and, there's no such thing as complete ideological neutrality. I mean, as you're saying, there are values that we want to impart in our kids so they become productive citizens of a democratic society. And at the same time, you have a group of sort of social justice warriors in teachers' unions, among teachers, in teachers' colleges for sure, who are trying to who have a political project there.
Yeah. Yes. Schools of education are just evil.
Right.
That's how it has gotten from universities to K through 12.
Absolutely.
And that's been going on for a long time.
And so the question, institutional neutrality can't mean complete ideological neutrality. I don't even think it means that in a university setting either, by the way. There's still basic, like even the liberal idea itself is not ideologically neutral. But it's the rules of the game that we need to have. We agree on that we need to have in a functioning university or a functioning democratic society. And I still think that's the case with the university. And I think there are tough issues. A colleague of mine recently wrote an article about called "No Flags in the Classroom," and she was arguing, like, other than the U.S. American flag, get rid of the Israel flag, get rid, because there was one case at Beverly Hills where there was a school that was, in order to support Jewish students, put in the Israeli flag, but also, don't put in the rainbow gay rights flag in a classroom. Don't do the fist flag, the Black Lives Matter flag, or whatever.
That sounds like a good idea to me.
Right. Just, so you're not getting a pure institutional neutrality. And I don't know how to talk about gay rights without sort of, my instincts are exactly as yours are, but, I realize that we're not escaping the cultural war parameters that have been set up for us.
But if there are no flags in the classroom, I have a question for you. Can students wear flags on their armbands?
Yeah, I think that they should be allowed to do that. I don't think that teachers should be able to do it, though.
I agree.
Yeah,
I think, and I picked armbands, because of the famous Supreme Court case that said students have to be allowed to wear black armbands in protest of the Vietnam War. That public schools can't ban them.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable to me. I don't think kids altogether lose their First Amendment rights, but when they enter into a classroom, but it seems to. But I think a teacher who would do that is creating a political tone in the classroom that
I
probably should
agree.
be disallowed.
So it's
Um,
it's institutional neutrality in that sense, right?
yes,
Teachers.
institutional neutrality, right? That doesn't mean that you're trying to sanitize everybody's opinions. One of the things that was at this Heterodox Academy conference that I attended was this sort of tension about like what is the Overton window in various parts of the campus community. So, for example, the campus quad, it's pretty much of an open space. If you're going to allow protests, I guess you pretty much have to allow all protest, right? Like whether it's from the river to the sea, or whether it would be a neo-Nazi rally, or whether it would be environmental climate change protests. It's basically, you're saying that's an open forum, and anything goes. A classroom is
It's not.
probably different.
Even
It's not an
a
open,
university classroom is different, right?
right?
I mean, it's fine to bring up, maybe even for a teacher to express opinions in a class on the Middle East conflict. The teacher, I think, might say, well, here's what I think. He or she should not shut down opposing views, and in fact should invite them. But a calculus professor who starts talking about how he or she supports Hamas, that's inappropriate.
Right. So I agree with that. Although I think that a great Middle East professor would not have to share their opinion, and would just, I think, like, that's a better teaching practice than the one where you exercise your academic freedom in the classroom and tilt the discussion. That said, I think there's some tensions that people are feeling around this. And so let's say you have a college has a program on anti-racism. That's an academic program, not just a DEI program.
Okay.
And the professor decides to just teach, let's just do gender studies. I mean, we don't even have to have something of such recent vintage. We take gender studies, and the professor has very strong held views, and the professor says, you can say anything you want as long as it doesn't offend my identity, or doesn't uproot doesn't reinforce my oppression. This is a real life example.
Completely inappropriate.
Inappropriate. But so does a university's desire to create an open university consistent with those principles outweigh the professor's academic freedom? Can they come to say, look, you can express your opinion, but if you say something like that actually suppresses dissent in the classroom, you are violating our policies, and therefore you must stop.
I mean, I would prefer to do it more gently, but
okay.
yes,
You started gently, and then the person ignored your gentleness, and now now it's back to the general counsel's office, and the student who expressed the dissenting point of view in that classroom is still upset because they can't express it. So what do you do about that?
I think if someone is acting inconsistent, I mean, basically that teacher is not doing his or her job. His or her job is to educate the students, not indoctrinate them, and to essentially make them think and turn them into critical thinkers. And if you don't allow, if you say some topics, some statements are off the table, you're not able to do your job.
So academic freedom protects a teacher from expressing an opinion either in the classroom or in some scholarly journal, but it doesn't shield them against the charge of academic malpractice, really, or
well put.
Okay. And I feel like that needs to be fleshed out. And I think that, that universities have not really developed answers. Let's say that was happening in certain departments, and I think we could probably name them, and you'd find every single professor agreed on essentially everything that was important. And then inculcated their students in their ideas and would shut down any dissenting view. You can start to say to the university could audit itself and say, I'm sorry, but that's not living up to our standards of academic inquiry, right?
Yes, exactly. And I think, I mean, some universities have made a start by getting setting up task forces to investigate anti-Semitism. Now, it seems to me that's sort of trendy, and it's a response to Trump, and they should be doing more than just looking at anti-Semitism. They should be looking at orthodoxy and whether orthodoxy is being promoted or insisted upon in the classroom. But the fact that these task forces have been successful in the sense that they have actually dug into things and found anti-Semitism, I think suggests that universities could do the same if they said, no, now what we want to look for is academic malpractice, or orthodoxy. Let's see what we find. And I think even just exposing it to the sunlight that way would help.
Yeah, I agree. And I guess one last question here. I'm one of those people, I assume you are, who looked at what was happening on college campuses after those infamous hearings in December and before then as well, of course, and said, okay, look, I mean, I didn't disagree with the fact that I want these presidents of universities to stand up for free speech, but what was exposed was their hypocrisy, right? The fact that they really hadn't done so, and so now all of a sudden you're a free speech purist. But what's happening in some cases after they've so fallen down in their response to anti-Semitism, or they've treated it differently than every other form of bigotry that they've ruthlessly rooted out. They're now saying, okay, well, we'll have an anti-Semitism DEI style video in which all the students go to their orientation, and this just happened. This is happening in Northwestern, I worry that it actually. There's this video at Northwestern University I actually haven't watched, so I can't comment on to what degree it actually imposes a view of anti-Semitism on students. But I think but there's some danger in Jewish organizations or Jewish trustees and sort of just saying, okay, now we want our DEI moment.
Oh, yeah. No, I agree with you completely for two reasons. One, the reason that you're suggesting is I don't want to impose the orthodoxy about anti-Semitism any more than I want to enforce the orthodoxy about, woke or anti-racism. But the other one is I don't think it's going to help. That is, I think just sort of, getting DEI to recognize that there's anti-Semitism and include it in the list of victims. Well, we still have this list of the oppressed. Only now we consider Jews oppressed, but we're still dividing the world into the oppressed and the oppressors. And and we're still treating people according not as individuals, but as members of ethnic, religious, cultural, gender groups. And that's the betrayal of the Enlightenment principles that I think is so bad about DEI in the first place.
Yeah, I agree. Well, this has been a really fun and enriching, and I like to bring on people like you who have thought deeply about these as I've been thinking deeply about them. I'd like to think, at least, and that allows me to sort of bring these ideas in and test them out a little bit. And I feel like as I do that, I get more clear myself. So I really appreciate your having those conversations with me, and I look forward to continuing to speak.
Yes, and you have. I'm honored to be on your podcast. I know I went to the website, and you have quite an impressive list of guests. So I'm glad to be one of them.
Thank you for being one. All right. Well, thank you very much. Until next time.
Thank you.